Hi everyone, so for today's video, we will talk about the basic principles of an oral interpretation. In oral interpretation, it is not just an easy task and it is not just like getting a literary text and reading it plainly in the front of the classroom. There are so many elements that we first need to understand. And as a literature teachers, as an actor and actresses, probably practitioners of communication, oral interpretation would really help us a lot in terms of making our speeches, our activities in the classroom, our engagement in general, in much more alive and relatable to our audience. But first, let us try to find out what is an oral interpretation. Oral interpretation is the art of communicating to an audience, a work of literature in its intellectual, emotional, and aesthetic entirety. Oral interpretation involves the performing of literature allowed to communicate meaning to an audience. An interpreter analyzes the literature and uses his or her voice to communicate the results of the analysis. So, guys, always remember that you are not trying to create message to persuade or inform your listeners, but instead, you are trying to help the listeners to see the images you are creating orally. Your goal is to share the meaning of the literature as you interpret, okay? So that you can bridge the author's perspective to your audience. Why is it that oral interpretation is important? Because it is very productive type of genre for students to show their critical, interpretative skills, their ability to organize their ideas, and to express them with effective language of choices, as well as for us to interpret certain passages of literature in a much more emotional and vivid way. So, what are some common forms of oral interpretations? First, we have dramatic interpretation. Dramatic interpretation interprets and presents a piece of literature using voice, body, and facial expression. Usually, the material is almost exclusively dialogue with almost no narration. The selections are commonly taken from plays, novels, and short stories. Next is prose interpretation. Prose interpretation, or also known as prose reading. It is a non-memorized competition event in which competitors choose a published piece of work that is a dramatic or humorous solo that is done in first person. Next, we have poetry interpretation. Poetry interpretation is regarded as recreating the thoughts and emotions of the poet in the minds of the audience. Yes, because it is written to be read aloud. We have programmed oral interpretation. A program interpretation is chosen from 2 or 3 different genres of competitive interpretation, which is prose, poetry, and drama. A primary focus of this event should be on the development of the theme through the use of narrative story, language, and or characterization. We have duo interpretation. It is most commonly called as interpretation event between 2 performers from the word duo. This event has a time limit of 10 minutes and is performed from a fully memorized script. Reader's theater. Reader's theater is a style of theater in which the actors present dramatic readings of narrative material without costumes, props, scenery, or special lighting. Actors use only vocal expressions to help the audience understand the story. Now, how can one communicate characterization through oral interpretation? So, characterization can be communicated through oral interpretation with the use of our voices, actions, eyes, face, posture, gestures, reaction, direct statement, thoughts, and moods. Now, Yomi asked, why is it important for you to choose your own material for oral interpretation? It is important because your material understand it. You reach this understanding by considering both the meaning and the feeling of the selection. Once you have determined the meaning and feeling of a particular work, you must adapt your interpretation to acquire to the requirements of the form, which is prose, poetry, or the drama. Now, here are some of the oral interpretations and delivery techniques. First, you must know the general content of the selection, or shall we say, you should know the theme of the certain literary text. That means you are interpreting in it in accordance to the overall theme of the text or the story. So the second one is consider the attitude, feelings, emotions, temperament of the person who wrote the selection. Know the character of the text you are interpreting and study the personality that the character has as well as the background of the character. What kind of life he or she lived that made him that kind of person, and it takes about the kind of makeup that the person has. Third, we have identified the words and ideas you need to emphasize. And of course, you must know the language that is being used in the text, the author's word of choice. Why? Because if you don't understand what is being expressed in a certain way, you cannot communicate its meaning to an audience. Word choices by the author is very significant in interpretation. Does the author use words that are nobility, or probably the author use words that are for common people? Or maybe the author choose words that are very local or cultural in their context. The words suggest the kind of interpretation we will use, and it unlocks something in our oral interpretation. Number 4, we have recall your own experiences. Yes, for us to relate the text. Number 5, emphasize the meaning. We also have the mood, in which the interpreter creates the mood or emotional feeling of the literature, and this is done through a non-verbal messages such as facial expressions and etc. So the types of drama are comedy, tragedy, tragicomedy, and melodrama. Contain different characteristics of drama, in which it includes plot, characters, music, dialogue, and others. And also, most plays contain elements of some or all of these different genres. So once again, this is Jesel, and thank you so much for being with me with my short discussion about oral interpretation today. Happy teaching, everyone!